There we go. All right, y'all, welcome back. Wonderful job on this last round of papers, man. You guys have really taken in my notes and ideas about improvement and really kicked them up. Um, yeah, so I'm really proud of you guys. Okay, this reading is going to be Frantz Fanon, "The Wretched of the Earth on Violence," and it's a very man, it's a very violent response to colonialism. And Frantz Fanon was a French. No, he was from Martinique, right? Was born into sort of French colonialism, and then fought in the Algerian Civil War against France, right? And so he had always been sort of a Marxist, radical, revolutionary, anti-colonialist. Okay, so just some very basic background on who this guy is and why these ideas came from where they came from. Okay, so on violence. Fanon says that basically decolonization in and of itself inherently is violence, right? And so we'll go through his arguments. This is a pretty big piece, so I'm going to try to break this out piece by piece. He also says that decolonization is also his sort of inherently historical, right? And that it can't be detached from the history of colonization itself. One of the arguments at the time of the 1960s is when all of this, the basically the late 40s to the late 60s, right, was a period of massive decolonization. Portuguese, um, British, German, French, man, Spanish, all of these colonies started to just crumble under the weight of globalization um, and sort of morality shifting. So again, Fanon gives this response, and he says it's historical, and the people who are arguing that we need to just talk about today and how we need to stop decolonization and the violence of decolonization are trying to trick you basically into thinking like this is the starting point. And they're like, no, the violence on us, on the sort of what he calls the natives, pejoratively, you take using their language against them. Um, you use violence and colonization on us, so we need to take that precursor of history into consideration. He says, quote, "There first were the indigenous peoples, the natives, the whatever you want to call them. There are things you should and should not call them. I should make that clear. Anyway, okay. The indigenous' first confrontation was colored by violence and their cohabitation, or rather, the exploitation of the colonized by the colonizer continued at the point of the bayonet and under cannon fire. And so he said, this was never a choice. This was always about violence. And if you did not, if you were unwilling to assimilate, then the consequences were violence against your body." And he says, decolonization, therefore, implies the urgent need to thoroughly challenge the colonial situation. And then there was this really hot quote that kind of like, I was like, dang, that is rough. He says, quote, "In its bare reality, decolonization reeks of red hot cannonballs and bloody knives. For the last can only be the first after a murderous and decisive confrontation between two protagonists." And so, like, man, read that one over. I've been thinking about it for about a day or two now and wondering, how did it get to this point? Is it true? So, yeah, really, yeah, it kind of jumped out of the page at me. He also says the colonizers, because he basically says there's this almost Marxist dichotomy, right, between colonized and colonizer, and he uses a lot of the sort of Marxist analytics um, to dive into the analytics of colonization and decolonization. But then later he talks about why it doesn't quite fit, right? So we're taking the model of Marxism, um, but instead of the proletariat versus the bourgeois, it's the quote unquote natives versus the colonizers, the whites, right? Okay, so he says he basically quotes six different tools of the oppressor, right, of the colonizer, to quell the colonized. And he says, of course, first is the police, right, the military, the police walking our neighborhoods every day, beating on people. The second is education. And he says, whether secular or religious, the teaching of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, the exemplary integrity of workers decorated after 50 years of loyal and faithful service, the fostering of love for harmony and wisdom, those aesthetic forms of respect for the status quo instill in the exploited a mood of submission and inhibition which considerably eases the tasks of the agents of law and order. So he's saying the educational system in these colonial systems was set up to teach people to assimilate, and that it was merely a way to quell the population by getting them to submit to the colonized, the sort of apartheid regime, right? And here again, he uses some sort of Marxist language, right? He's talking about the workers, and then sort of the status quo, and he uses the word exploitation and submission. So these are all the sort of the key words, right, of Marxist language and Marxist language. um, okay, so section three, he says, is segregation. This is apartheid is um, the third tool in the colonizer's tool chest, right? And so he says there's two different types of sort of apartheid. There's the Eurotype, or two different like areas, right? Geographical distinctions. And there's sort of the Eurotype, what he says, and this looks like Europe. It's got running water, it's got clean water, it's got electricity, it's got lights, it's got bars, and people are, riding their bicycles on the sidewalks, and there's actual paved roads and all of these sorts of things. Um, and then he says the second, though, is, quote, the native town, right? And he also calls it the shanty town. And he gives a couple of, ironic sentences. He says, a disreputable place for disreputable people. And so that was sort of what the colonizers would do, is they would force people into these horrible places and then say, oh, look, they live in horrible places. Look how animalistic they are, So he's totally poking fun of the colonizers with that quote. And he says, it is true there is not a single colonized subject who at least once a day does not dream of taking the place of the colonizer. And so he's like, yeah, you're worried that we want to take your place and take your power. Well, hell yeah, look at the inequality that exists between us. Not a day goes by I don't think about that. So it was like, wow. Okay, the fourth tool in sort of the colonizers toolbox is inequality, right? And so this is a real sort of Marxist tone. And he says just the vast unequalness. So, I mean, if you look at a picture of, I don't know, 1992 Johannesburg, South Africa, right? Absolutely gorgeous inner city filled with wealthy white people, and absolutely impoverished hovels outside the city, little shanty towns. And it was purposeful and it was well thought, and it was a shame. And things didn't go well necessarily after apartheid ended, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's rough to see some of those pictures. So this extraordinary inequality that we don't even really see in the United States, unless you say compare like the Clintons with some homeless family, right? But it's kind of that absurd, right? There is just people are having to share water, they're having to share food, they're having to, five, six, seven, eight, nine people on the floor of this little, lean-to shack. It sucks. Okay. The fifth is propaganda. The fifth tool in the toolbox of the colonizer, he says, is propaganda mixed with dehumanization, right? And he uses this word Manichaean a lot. And this, I should explain, comes from sort of an ancient, very, very strict sect of early Christianity called the Manichaeans. And they saw things as they're either sinful or they're not, period, black and white. And so it's become this sort of catch-all for dichotomous or black and white, that sort of thing, right? He says, the colonial world is a Manichaean world. The colonist is not content with physically limiting the space of the colonized, i.e., with the help of his agents of law and order. As if to illustrate the totalitarian nature of colonial exploitation, the colonist turns the colonized into a kind of, quote, quintessence of evil. So he's saying, like, we're even trying to warp the minds of, say, political rivals or racial rivals or apartheid rivals by making them look less than human, right? And then he says, quote, the colonist is not content with stating that the colonized world has lost its values, or worse, never possessed any. The quote, native is declared impervious to ethics, representing not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, dare we say, the enemy of values. In other words, absolute evil. So he's saying this dehumanizing language is not making anything better. It makes things completely worse, and it also leads to real problems with people even trying to get things like jobs or provide for their family, and it's just dehumanizing. And then the last one he says is sort of the evangelical church and the Catholic Church, and he says the church in the colonies is a white man's church, a foreigner's church. It does not call the colonized to the way of God, but to the ways of the white man, to the ways of the master, to the ways of the oppressor. And so this ties back a lot to sort of the ideas of not only Malcolm X's From the Bullet to the Ballot, but also sort of some of the musings of Rousseau, who says that sort of the church's doctrines get twisted for political power, and the pulpit gets the power far more than anyone else. And so they're not exactly analogous, but they're sort of tangential, right? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and on the next one, we'll talk about what causes inevitably to a revolution, according to Fanon in his, we'll continue his sort of Marxist analysis. All right, thanks so much for being here.